Well, it's good for us to be together on this Reformation Sunday. For over 500 years, we've been gathering with the same purpose, under different circumstances, trying to remember that the purpose of the church and the heart of the church is to get to the good news of God. Now, if you want additional information on the good news of God outside of this worship service, you should go to Dean's class on Wednesday, The Prodigal God. It's a book that is much loved and getting to the heart of the story, not of the prodigal son, but of the prodigal father. And we might say that that image is a wonderful image for this Sunday because in many ways this is the Christian church. Two brothers living in the same house that don't like each other very much or in different circumstances, but because the Father calls us to live together and come to the same house, this is part of the work of Reformation. The story isn't about the sons kind of finding their proper reconciliation. It's living in the tension that if we have the same Father, it's going to change our relationship to one another. And this gives us an inkling of the effect of the good news. We must resist with every fiber of our being that we will reduce what this is merely to a historic idea and see it as a planted seed in our lives bearing fruit. And the Reformers knew this. They said, look, we've done the Reformation of doctrine. When will you all do the Reformation of life? When will your lives be shaped according to this truth, which Jesus tells us about in John chapter 8? And the idea that it's a difficult row to hoe is obvious in Jeremiah when God talks about his ex. If you can imagine the prayer life of Israel, or maybe our prayer life to a certain degree, God gets a text message. Who's that from? Oh, it's from my ex. Who's that, Israel? This is the way God describes the relationship. We were married and they cheated on me, and yet they still ask me for stuff and they still text me. And you go, well, what are you going to do? And God goes, well, I'm going to do what I do, which is be faithful to them. This is the story of the good news. Not that we are faithful to God, but that God is faithful to us. Even after being a jilted lover by our many infidelities, God is yet faithful to us. And the news of this day isn't, all right, everybody, now try it again and get your acts together. The news of this day is God has declared there will be a different future, and it is now the task of the church to walk in faith and to go into that future. Yesterday we had a funeral here. About a year ago, we got a phone call at the church. In fact, they meant to call a different church. They got the wrong church, but I told them, well, you actually got the right church. A woman called and she said, my ex-husband has been diagnosed with ALS. I want you to come to the house and save him. And I said, well, that's not really a service we provide, but we can put you on the mailing list if you'd like. And I said, no, I'll come and talk to him. I go, does he want me to talk to him? Sometimes you have to be careful, especially if it's an ex. She might want to punish him by having the pastor come to the house. And I go and I spoke to him for over an hour and we talked about the good news. And this is exactly the issue that we have, which is this guy was living his life. His name was Randy Klein, tow truck driver. You may remember Klein Towing in Huntington Beach, if you remember that. He fell at work. They thought it was a workman's comp claim. It wasn't. It was his nerves dying in his legs. And this began his journey of ALS. What will be the good news for him? And this is what we talked about for over an hour. And his ex-wife told me after he died, because that was the only conversation I ever had with him. A huge weight was lifted off his shoulders. He heard something good. Not about just the world, but about his own illness, his own death. Not that it was good, but that God would redeem it, and that there would be a future. And so they even had a tow truck parked outside because he worked for Best Towing, so Klein Towing became Best. This church was filled with tow truck drivers yesterday. And they were all wearing red. I said, oh my gosh, this is perfect for Reformation Sunday. But they don't go to a church like ours. So they said, what? And I go, it's good you're in red. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But I told the owner of the tow truck company was sitting right where John Hendrickson's sitting. And I looked at her during the service and I said, you know, we're in the same business. I go, I do the spiritual towing. This is the work of the church, which is things fall apart. Like I had a car that died not too long ago. And you go, what's wrong? And you think you know, and you're trying to diagnose the codes and figure it out. And usually the problem's something different than what you think. And so I told them, I go, there's nothing I can do. Sitting with someone that has ALS, I don't have any power over that. But I can tow you to the Father's house and see what happens when you're brought into his embrace. This is part of the Reformation, some of the spiritual towing that we are committed to a world that believes that good news has determined a different future. then history on its own, which will collapse under its own weight, under its own violence. A different future. This is what Paul means by justification, and I've told you this definition before, but it's very important you understand it because even many Lutherans don't understand it because it's been reduced to an idea and not the possibility of a new future. I told you we were working with a Superior Court judge, and we set up homeless court. This was the idea that homeless people who had been sort of piled up with various infractions, all misdemeanors, public, camping, loitering, whatever it was, and they were being saddled with fines. And the court didn't want them in their system because they were filling up all the calendar. And they didn't want to be in the court because they couldn't afford to pay the fine. So we set up this court where they would come and their fines would be transmuted into service hours and they would be released of their obligations to the state. And we had a young woman come, a young homeless woman, maybe 19 years old. And the judge said to her, "It says here that you want to join the military." She says, "I do, but I can't because I have this current problem." And again, these are all misdemeanors, no serious crimes. And she goes, "If I release you, what would you do?" She said, "I would go to the recruiter right away and say, I'm ready to go." And she goes, "No service for you. Your service will be to our country." And she signed a document, and she walked out of that courtroom a different person. Now, if you looked at her, she was dressed the same, she looked the same, she smelled the same, she talked the same. Everything about her life appeared exactly the same, except her future. She now had a future he hadn't had until the judge declared that I will give you a new direction. This is what Paul means by justification, that God makes a declaration. That's why he says it's not about your works. God declares, I have made a new future for you in Jesus my Son. And now, by faith, enter into it. This creates a lot of human anxiety because it means you're just living in trust. This is why the pilgrims were so worried. They go, well, how do we know we're saved? Well, you have to work really hard, and that'll show that. It's a verification that you're saved. This is part of the American work ethic, actually, came from this Calvinistic anxiety. Well, how do we know that God will, in fact, secure this future? And this is the church's work. We know in our current environment, particularly as we get ready for an election, we know that at the local level, many of the questions being adjudicated are not local questions. The national questions have been pushed down to our local conversations and in many ways have made our local processes less functional than they were before even. And so part of the reform isn't just an idea, it is people living in community and making local connections and being good neighbors to each other. Trusting that this good future that God has secured for us in Christ isn't just for us, but for others. I did a wedding this week. It was a busy week. Did a wedding this week, and I told the bride, and they're not Lutheran. That's a whole other story, but I told the bride, I said, well, I normally wear my priest suit, or as Jim Kavanaugh calls it, my Superman suit. And she said, oh, please don't do that. She said, that's not part of our tradition. They're very Protestant. She didn't want to appear too Catholic, And I go, okay, well, what would you like me to wear? She says, well, wear a suit with a black tie or what? I don't have a black tie. I never need to wear a black tie. I never get invited to black tie events, like that at least. So I go, all right, fine. I go, oh, of course I have a tie. So I'm thinking to myself, well, no, I have to go buy a tie. And I end up going over to Kohl's. I'm walking into Kohl's on Adams, and a young man sitting on a bench, he goes, excuse me, sir. I said, yes. He said, do you have any work for me? I said, I'm just here to get a tie, but thank you. And I walk in, and then I walk out, and I go, so what do you mean, do I have any work for you? What are you doing here? Oh, he says, I'm a mechanic, and I moved down here, and I've been in an accident. Of course, he has some story about how he's ended up where he is. I said, where are you living right now? I live in my car with my tools. He goes, I have all of my tools. I just need to connect with someone. And I go, give me your phone number, and I'm going to call somebody and see if he can give you work. And he took out an index card and handed it to me. He goes, here it is. I already have it ready. And so I wrote one of our partners, a partner of the church, and I said, I cannot verify this guy's story. I can't tell you if he's good or bad. I just know he's asked for an opportunity, and maybe you can give it to him. And he says, I'll call him tomorrow. And it's the idea that there are people who just need the circle of opportunity extended to them, and not just the circle of opportunity for various works of commerce and daily life, though they do need that. This is the concrete application of the gospel. But even more so, the opportunity to enter into God's future and to say there is something different that is happening in our age. The time of the Reformation, not unlike our own time, was an increasingly apocalyptic time. People thought the world was ending, and they had reason to think the world was ending. And simultaneously, you had the world of the Renaissance emerging, saying there is a future where human beings can be grounded in the deepest truths about ourselves and be renewed. And this is why I'm talking about the local level, because we need to renew all of the basic structures and foundations of our society. Renew families, renew marriages, renew faith commitments, renew neighborliness, renew opening up opportunities for people. When we say the mission of the gospel is good news, if the message isn't good news by the end, then we haven't finished the work of the church, and in many ways we haven't even begun it. This is why the prodigality of God is important, because for both of the boys who live in the Father's house, whether they like each other or not, it's good news for both of them. And even if they can't allow that God will give the same gift to someone they hate, i.e. a brother, it doesn't change what God is doing. Just because we have certain feelings and prejudices doesn't change what God is doing. God is going to do these good things because God has declared there is a future we can walk into by faith. Now you'll remember we did a class on current statistics and studies about the place and role of the churches in the United States. The rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, if you remember that study. And with sober eyes, we should realize that many of our structures, our denominations, our churches are collapsing all around us in the United States. Not just around us, just look around some of our cities near us. Literally collapsing all around us. Thank God this church has been a little island of reprieve. In fact, we've gathered people from different places because of some of this collapsing that's going on. And so what are we to do as the world around us changes so quickly, beyond our ability to react to it with some of our sclerotic systems? And this is why I thought today not just to wear red, but we can wear blue. This has been one of our answers. What are we to do? We are to go and build new relationships. This is with our church in Japan. We are to go and build new relationships and to continue to do the work that trusts there is a good future. This is a Kune mission. There was a little church in Japan that had only 2 people left in it. It was started by American missionaries from South Carolina many years ago. And through the generous contributions of this church and also our Japanese partners, they've begun to renew that church. They've begun to rebuild that church. Empty spaces are filling again. People who are hurting are being ministered to and fed. Places of natural disaster, healing and rebuilding are happening because of this, something we started here with people in Japan. We are not waiting for someone to come. Well, who's going to take care of this problem? It is us who must step into this future in faith and trust that the good news that Jesus provides, the truth that sets people free, isn't just an idea, it is a person. And we see it happening in personal ways and in personal places. And so we've created this mission to say there is a good future. As churches in Japan, empty. As churches in the United States, empty. The task forward is the same as it has been, to be a people of good news, to be a people who believe in God's good future, and to do the work of renewal. Let our generation renew these spaces. Let our generation do these works and these commitments. And let that be the sign of reform, the true message of the Reformation. Amen.